Hi, this is Jay. Welcome to my channel. Now, condensation is a big problem, whether you're living in a tent or living in a car. So today we're going to discuss how it happens and how we can fight it, or at least try to reduce it. We as outdoors people hate it. It gets everything wet, and in the worst case, over time, it can create mold because of constant dampness. By understanding why it occurs, we can come up with ideas to prevent it, or at the very least, to manage it and reduce it as much as we can. Because in certain environments, you're just never going to be able to prevent it altogether. In case you don't want to hear exactly how it occurs, and you just want to get straight to the way I deal with condensation and how to reduce it, there's a time in the description. Just go down in there and just click on that, and you'll skip all the whys and hows and go straight to what you can do yourself. So for all those who want to really understand the problem, and by understanding it, you can also figure out new ways to solve it that I'm not recommending here. So I think it's good if everyone understands it, more people generate new ideas, and I think it's good to share with everyone altogether then. To start, condensation is the process where water vapor turns back into a liquid. There's also another term called deposition, where water vapor turns straight into a solid. And that occurs when it's super cold out. And I don't know how many of you slept in the winter months, but you can wake up and just have layers of frost on your windshield, on the inside, or on the ceiling of your tent, or even on the top of your sleeping bag. And that's deposition. Now, the big key things to remember is that warmer air can hold more water vapor. Colder air cannot. So if there's a certain amount of water vapor in the air, my explanation wasn't good enough, I thought, so I'd record it again. But imagine at a certain temperature, it has the capacity to hold this much water vapor. Now, imagine that at that situation, there is this much water vapor in the air. Also, now imagine that as a much cooler temperature, it can only maintain this much water in the air. So this is the capacity, and as the temperature decreases over the night, the capacity reduces more and more. Once it gets past the point where it can only hold that much water vapor, that is a dew point. And if it gets past it a little bit, all that excess water vapor is going to cause condensation. As it gets colder and colder, and the temperature can hold less water, all that extra water is just going to condense on surfaces. And that's the problem that occurs when it gets really cold overnight, or even during the day. It's possible if it drops in temperature enough. But that's the key thing to remember. It's basically warm air holds more, cold air holds less. So when that warm air becomes colder, that excess water vapor turns to water liquid. The temperature that the air has to hit before the air can no longer sustain that much water vapor is called the dew point. Now, the dew point fluctuates wildly based on the relative humidity of the air and the temperature. So it's not super important for our discussion, but it's important to remember the dew point there. Another way to think it through is, say in warm air, the relative humidity is 50%. If the air cools and the amount of water vapor in the air stays the same, that relative humidity will actually be much higher, although there has been no additional water added to the air, the percentage will go up. Because once it gets colder enough, the relative humidity will hit 100%, and that's when the water condenses, and that's also the dew point, when the relative humidity is 100%. Condensation occurs on your tent when the air around your tent cools enough that it cools the surface of your tent to the dew point. Once the surface of your tent is at the dew point, you can get condensation on the outside, just from the air around it, or from the inside. The reason you usually get more condensation on the inside than the outside is because there's usually more moisture in there from yourself. You emit moisture when you breathe, and when you sweat, your body is constantly emitting moisture. So if you don't have the ventilation, the inside air will be more humid. Well, let's not use the word humid. The inside air will have more water vapor than the outside air. So it's more likely that you'll have condensation on the inside than the outside. Sometimes you could have both when it's really humid. You can even get condensation on the walls of your tent. If you have a bathtub floor, if it's cool enough, down there, it'll actually condense on outside and start pooling down, or at least get it damp. So if your sleeping bag touches the walls, you can actually get a little moisture from the walls. So you have to be aware of your tent and try to keep everything away from the walls as best as you can. Condensation can also occur on the surface of your sleeping bag. That happens quite often, and a lot of times you'll see people drying out their bags. It can be funny at times, but it is really annoying, especially when you have a down bag, and it's worrisome because the moisture will make it not work as well. So it's just not gonna be as warm as you would hope. Now, the reason you get condensation in your sleeping bag is as the air that you're in is much warmer, so it can hold a lot more water vapor. So as that warmer air goes through the insulation, once it hits the surface is going to be much cooler than the inside. And if the amount of water vapor in that air is below or is over the dew point of the air around it, it'll condense on the top. Now, it's possible that the water vapor coming off your tent hits the outside air, but the outside air has so little water vapor, or it's warm enough that it can sustain the water that's in the air. The warm, moist air will hit the surface, and then the air will just evaporate and just mix up with the regular air around it, and it will raise the relative humidity of the air outside because of that water vapor mixing in. But the good news is you won't get condensation on your sleeping bag. The bad news is you will at that point increase the water vapor in the air inside your tent or your car, and then when it hits the surface of the tent, like window or ceiling, it'll possibly condense there. So that's why often you get condensation on the ceiling of your tent, but maybe not on your sleeping bag, or sometimes both, and that's worst case, of course. In an ideal world, it would be great if the air coming off your sleeping bag had just little enough water vapor that when it hits the outside air, it doesn't condense. And ideally, even if the moisture that does mix into the air and inside the tent is still kept so low that it won't condense on your tent. So we have to try to figure out ways to reduce how much moisture is introduced in your sleeping bag as well as into the air in your tent or in your car. Now that we know exactly how it works, we have to think of ways to fight it or at least reduce it. You're not gonna like this, but my #1 solution to prevent or fight condensation in a tent or car is to sleep cool or cold. Some people really don't like that. I don't mind it. I don't like to sleep super cold, but cool is fine. You just really want to sleep at a point where your body does not sweat at all. You may think that even when you're comfortable that you're not sweating at all, but the body is very different. There's different parts of the body that will actually create more heat and just generate more water vapor. Like any exposed skin areas, generally they'll stay cooler, but like generally the hip area or inside the legs, because all the skin contacting, it'll get warmer. And there's always sweating there, like in the armpits. It's always more moist than the rest of your body. So you may think you're okay, but you're still expelling water vapor into the air by sweating. So by keeping cool, you minimize how much your body uses water to try to cool itself down. So when you go to sleep, don't bundle up all the way because it's gonna get colder late at night. You have to just kind of keep yourself uncovered and then be comfortable with the idea that throughout the night, you're gonna wake up cold and you have to pull the sleeping bag closer, even closer later on, put a hat on later on, pull a puffy over you later on, anything you can to warm up later, but you really don't want to be fully warm when you go to sleep. Unfortunately, that's just how it is. Unless you have a temperature controlled environment, like you have a heater of some kind that does not also introduce moisture into the air, that's just the way it is. I know some people have tried propane heaters in cars or tents, But when you burn propane, one of the byproducts is water vapor, and that actually creates a lot more water vapor in a tent and it just gets everything wet. Like wood stoves work, diesel heaters work, but for backpacking sake, there's really no other option. You just have to reduce how much water your body expels. But Jay, of course, you breathe through your mouth, right? You expel water through your mouth. Of course. Yeah, you expel a lot of moisture through your mouth, and there's really nothing you can do except like be in super good shape so you don't have to breathe as much. But for me, when it's cool enough, I like to wrap something around my nose and mouth, because what you do is I usually use a shema when it's colder. If you do that, it'll actually condense the moisture on the fabric. If it's thick enough, it'll get the outside wet and not completely soak through. It's nice because the air you breathe will be a little warmer and a little bit more moist, so you don't kind of get coughs in the morning, especially when it's really cold. But really it's nice because all that water vapor sits on your neck gaiter or shema. During the day, ideally, if it's nice enough, it'll dry out. If you wrap it around your neck, the heat as you hike will evaporate it and it'll be dry by the evening, hopefully. But having something that catches the condensation instead of spreading all over the ceiling of your tent, so you have to wipe it down later, is a quick and easy way of reducing your breath moisture a little bit. A thin fabric like a buff, that'll work. If you put it over your mouth, you'll feel it getting wet, but it's so thin that it's going to saturate pretty quickly, and then you'll just start breathing moisture through it anyway. So it doesn't quite work as well. So I like to do something thicker, not as tight across your face like a buff either. That's why I really like the shema, because when you fold it, it's multi-layered and it's pretty thick and works out great. I think merino wool neck gaiters work great because all the moisture just sits on the outside and it doesn't soak in as well. So yeah. And of course, ventilation is one of the most important things you can do to fight condensation. If you can get the inside of your tent or car air the same, not relative humidity, but the same amount of moisture on the inside as the outside, then you won't get condensation on the inside. Now, unfortunately, the best way to do that is to, in a car, no matter how cold it is, you have to keep some of the windows open and also run a fan because the cracks just aren't enough. In a tent, I know some people like their privacy and they close out the vestibules, but you got to open them up. Open all the vestibules, all the vents that you can. Pretty much always keep them open unless it's raining, then you have to close them, or if it's snowing. And I often, even if I know it's going to snow, I'll keep the vestibule and everything open because I'm a pretty light sleeper, and when it starts snowing, I'll wake up and I'll close it all up. But you just have to keep everything open and keep the ventilation flowing as much as you can. Of course, ventilation alone won't help if you pick the bad locations. The big gist is stay away from anywhere that can introduce more water vapor into the air around you. Because if it saturates the air around you, as the air cools, you're going to get condensation. So you want to go somewhere where the relative humidity is starting pretty low. So when you breathe into it, you only increase it a little and you don't get that chance. Things like lakes, rivers, creeks, even big fields of moist grass, that'll all introduce moisture. Even areas with large puddles. If there are large puddles, that's all going to evaporate and just moist the air. And overnight, you're more likely to get dew on the outside of your tent as well as condensation on the inside of your tent. Another obvious thing, of course, is stay away from clouds. Sometimes it's great to camp way up because you get some views, but if there are clouds coming, clouds are basically air that's saturated with water vapor and it's turning into liquid water but spread out. So if you're in the clouds or in a fog, everything gets wet. I don't know if you've ever slept in the fog, but everything just feels damp after a while. Just because there's just so much water in the air that it just dumps it on the ground. It just starts attaching to everything. So stay away from clouds, fog, lakes, rivers, creeks, any bodies of water in general. In the very cold nights, the water vapor will deposit straight onto the windows and walls of your tent, even on the surface of your sleeping bag. And that's deposition again. And that's a problem because unlike liquid water, which will get on the ceiling of your tent and maybe drip down. When it turns to ice right on your tent, it just sticks there. And if you are sweating a lot and just breathing a lot of moisture into your tent and there's all the ventilation's closed off, all that moisture is going to collect on the surface of your tent and it'll actually just build up over time to the point where it'll start sagging little by little. And that's not good because it starts flapping. And the other problem too is that ice is hard to get off your tent. I always sleep with a rag next to my head, so when I wake up, I check for condensation and I just wipe everything down. If there's ice, I'll just leave everything alone and I'll pack everything up and just put everything in the backpack and then I'll wipe down all the ice. Because as you scrape the ceiling, you'll find that a lot of it will just sprinkle everywhere and just everything gets covered in ice like snow. It looks like it snowed in your tent when you do it. And then you gotta try to sweep it up before it melts. So that way you can kind of grab it and toss it out the door. But the problem is you can't get all of it off because it's frozen on. And you do the best you can, but also when you pack it up, you're carrying all that ice with you for the first several hours until you get a chance to dry it out. And with a single wall tent, it's even worse because if the ice is on the ceiling, you collapse it, it's all over the inside of your tent. Your floor will be all wet and you'll have to dry everything before you get to the next campsite. Otherwise, when you set your things up inside, it's just going to get soaked by all the moisture. So ice is a huge thing to fight. If you can prevent the deposition of ice inside your tent or in a car, the car windows, that's actually pretty bad because the windows, as the ice condenses, it gets thick, and if you're driving somewhere, you can't see anything throughout any of your windows. And then as it melts, it just drips water. It could get pretty bad. I've had it pretty bad sometimes. For a car windshield, one of the best things to do is put insulation on the windshields. That'll help reduce how much ice forms on the windshield. You'll find the spots where the insulation touches the window, you don't get as much ice as places that don't contact the window. The thing to worry about though is you're still getting condensation in other parts of your car. You just can't see it. So it could be like inside the doors, on the surface, and it's all going to melt and it's all going to be humid and you could cause mold. So instead of you focusing on insulation on the windows, you want to just reduce the amount of moisture that your body expels into the air and work on ventilation. I hope this was helpful to some. I hope this information will help people in the future, especially as more and more people are getting into single wall tents. Some people love their double wall tents. But condensation will also help them because your rainfly will still get soaking wet inside or just have chunks of ice in there. But the single wall tent, it's more of a problem. So hopefully it helps. Hopefully it helps people that car camp or live in a van that don't have a vent on top. They have to deal with the condensation. If you have any ideas that you do to combat condensation, please just share with them down below with everyone else. And if you could, specify if it's for a car or tent or both, because the kind of gear you have is different. The same principles apply, but the gear you have is different. So yeah, specify that in that way. Because some car ideas, tent ideas will transfer over to car ideas, but car ideas cannot transfer over to backpackers because you just can't carry a whole bunch of stuff. So yeah, good luck to you. I'll be starting February 1st around on the AT in 2022, and I'll be dealing with condensation all the time, mostly ice. On the Arizona Trail, I did deal with a lot of ice on the inside of the tent, and I kind of wonder if all that ice also was what put little holes all over the ceiling of my tent. So yeah, I'm gonna have to reduce the ice more than I did before. So good luck to you all, and hope everything works out this winter season we're coming up on here. Bye.